On January 16, 2014, Google announced something that sounded almost like science fiction. A contact lens that could read your blood sugar continuously, straight from your tears, with no needles at all. For millions of people with diabetes, it sounded like the end of finger pricks forever. The project had been developed secretly for 18 months inside Google X, the company's experimental research lab, the same team that would later work on self-driving cars and internet balloons. This was their attempt to solve something doctors had wanted for decades: painless, continuous glucose monitoring. For anyone with diabetes, the daily reality this was trying to fix is genuinely exhausting. Multiple finger pricks every single day, for life, just to know a number that changes constantly. A small, sharp, repeated inconvenience most people without diabetes never have to think about. The idea behind using tears wasn't actually new. Scientists had wondered about it for years. The real breakthrough Google was chasing wasn't the idea itself, but making it small enough, cheap enough, and reliable enough to actually work inside something as thin as a contact lens. The people behind it weren't strangers to this kind of ambitious engineering either. Brian Otis and Babak Perviz, the two lead researchers, had been electrical engineering professors at the University of Washington before Google recruited them specifically to chase ideas exactly like this one. Did you know this idea actually started with public research funding, not a corporate lab at all? The original concept traces back to work funded by the National Science Foundation, years before Google ever got involved, and turned it into a headline-grabbing announcement. The announcement made headlines around the world, and for good reason. If it worked, it genuinely would have changed daily life for hundreds of millions of people living with diabetes. The only question left was whether tears could actually deliver on that promise. The engineering packed into this lens was genuinely remarkable. A wireless chip and a glucose sensor, both embedded between two ultra-thin, soft layers of contact lens material, with a tiny pinhole letting real tear fluid seep in and reach the sensor underneath. Here's the part that genuinely surprises people. The lens had no battery at all. It drew its power wirelessly, the same basic technology behind a contactless payment card, from a hair-thin antenna woven right into the lens itself, activated only when a nearby reader device was close enough. The precision engineers were aiming for was genuinely ambitious. A glucose reading once every single second, continuously, all day. Compare that to a handful of finger pricks spread across an entire day, and the difference in how much information a patient would actually have is enormous. There was even a plan to make the lens communicate visually, not just wirelessly. Tiny built-in LED lights that could physically light up if glucose crossed above or below a safe range. A warning a wearer, or someone standing near them, could notice immediately, no phone required. And critically, the electronics were positioned specifically outside both the pupil and the iris, meaning nothing about the sensor itself would ever sit directly over the part of the eye actually used for seeing, a genuinely important safety detail baked into the design from the start. Google built thousands of these lenses in dozens of different physical forms while testing this design. A genuinely serious, well-resourced engineering effort, not a quick proof of concept thrown together for a single press announcement. On paper, and in the lab, this was a genuinely elegant piece of engineering. No battery, no wires, a reading every second, and a built-in warning system. The hardware side of this problem, it turned out, was never really the hard part. To understand why tears seemed like such an obviously good idea, it helps to know something most people never think about. Your body is constantly making tears, whether you're crying or not. And that fluid genuinely does contain a small amount of glucose from your bloodstream. Glucose reaches your tears through the same basic route it reaches nearly every fluid in your body. It diffuses out of tiny blood vessels near the surface of your eye into the fluid your eye naturally produces, meaning tear glucose does genuinely track blood glucose, at least in principle. Compared to every other non-invasive idea scientists had tried over the decades, sweat, saliva, even breath, tears had one enormous practical advantage. Your eye is already sitting right there, easy to access, and a contact lens is something tens of millions of people already wear comfortably every day. Here's a genuinely fascinating detail. Scientists had actually confirmed tear glucose was measurable as early as the 2000s, in careful laboratory studies using extremely sensitive equipment. The real question was never whether glucose was there, but whether a tiny, cheap, everyday sensor could read it reliably. There was one catch hiding underneath all of that promise, though, and it's easy to miss. The amount of glucose in tears is dramatically smaller than the amount in blood, roughly 10 to 30 times more dilute, depending on the person and the moment. That dilution alone doesn't sound fatal to the idea. Sensitive sensors can, in principle, detect very small quantities of something. But it's exactly this detail, small as it sounds, that quietly turned out to be the seed of the entire project's biggest problem. So the science made sense, the engineering worked, and the logic held together. On paper, this really should have worked. What actually happened next surprised even the scientists who spent years building it. On November 16, 2018, almost 5 years after the original announcement, Verily, the Google offshoot now running the project, posted a quiet blog update. Buried in careful, measured language was an admission that surprised almost nobody who'd been closely watching and disappointed millions who had been hoping. The company's own words were unusually direct for a corporate announcement. Their clinical work had found insufficient consistency between tear glucose readings and actual blood glucose levels. Not occasionally inconsistent, but inconsistent enough that no medical device could safely be built on top of it. They pointed specifically to what they called the complex on-eye environment, a diplomatic way of describing something genuinely messy. The human eye is constantly awash in blinking, evaporation, dust, wind, and its own chemistry, none of which stays still long enough for a tiny sensor to get a clean, stable reading. This wasn't a failure of ambition, effort, or talent. The same update noted the team had genuinely built thousands of working prototype lenses in numerous forms. It was a failure of one specific, stubborn piece of biology refusing to cooperate with an otherwise brilliant piece of engineering. Independent scientists outside Google had actually raised doubts about this exact correlation for years before the announcement. Published research repeatedly found the tear-to-blood glucose relationship was, at best, weak and inconsistent from person to person, and even hour to hour in the same person. It's worth being precise about what actually ended. Only the glucose sensing project was shelved. Verily continued other contact lens work with the same partner, including a lens for age-related farsightedness. This was a setback for one specific application, not the end of smart lenses altogether. A 5-year, well-funded, genuinely serious scientific effort had run headfirst into a problem nobody could engineer their way around. Not yet, anyway. To understand exactly why tears turned out to be such a stubborn source, you have to look closer at what's actually happening inside a single teardrop. Here's the detail that turns out to explain almost everything. Not all tears are the same tears. Your eyes produce two genuinely different kinds of fluid, and mixing them up is exactly what made those early readings so unreliable. Quick pause. If this breakdown is helping you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely takes a lot of effort to make videos like this, and your support keeps them coming. Reflex tears, the ones triggered by a speck of dust, a gust of wind, or a yawn, flood the eye with a completely different fluid composition than your steady, everyday basal tears, and even a small amount mixed in can throw off a glucose reading meaningfully. This exact distinction, basal versus reflex tears, turns out to be the single biggest breakthrough in more recent research. Scientists who specifically isolate and measure only basal tears see a meaningfully stronger, more trustworthy correlation with blood glucose than anyone got in those original 2014-era attempts. Beyond just which tears you're measuring, there's a second compounding problem. Tear glucose doesn't move in perfect lockstep with blood glucose in real time. There's often a genuine time lag, meaning a lens reading right now might actually reflect what your blood sugar was doing several minutes ago. And then there's the interference problem Verily specifically called out. Tears aren't pure glucose solution. They're a genuinely complex biological soup of proteins, salts, enzymes, and other molecules, some of which can confuse a sensor built to detect one specific tiny signal. Stack all three problems together: basal versus reflex contamination, a real-time lag, and biological interference, and you get a genuinely difficult engineering target. A signal that's already 10 to 30 times weaker than blood, wrapped in noise from three completely separate directions at once. None of these three problems are unsolvable in principle, and that distinction matters enormously, because genuinely hard and impossible turned out to be very different things once scientists actually understood exactly what they were fighting against. Google walking away from one specific approach didn't end the broader story. It just meant other researchers at universities and smaller companies around the world kept working on the same underlying problem from genuinely different angles. One of the most interesting alternatives skips the contact lens entirely. A company called NovioSense developed a tiny, flexible, spring-shaped sensor that sits comfortably under the lower eyelid instead, small enough to barely notice, but positioned to collect fluid without fighting the same blinking and evaporation problems a lens faces. That eyelid sensor has already been tested in real people, not just rabbits or lab models. A published clinical study found it could track glucose changes over time meaningfully better than the earlier lens-based attempts. Real evidence that a different physical approach can partly sidestep the interference problem. Other research groups stayed with the contact lens itself, but changed how it actually detects glucose. Instead of a purely electrical sensor, some now use a special coating that glows differently under light, depending on how much glucose it touches. A completely different physical trick for reading the same tiny signal. This diversity of approaches is genuinely the healthy sign of a scientific field working exactly as it should, rather than one company's single failed method ending the entire idea. Multiple independent groups now attack the identical problem with meaningfully different physics, multiplying the chances something eventually works reliably. One rabbit model study even combined glucose monitoring with something extra. A smart lens that could both detect rising glucose and automatically release a small dose of medication in response. An early hint of where this technology might eventually go beyond just monitoring. One company's 5-year effort ending wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the story genuinely widened, with more groups, more approaches, and more independent evidence than the original 2014 project ever had on its own. Fast forward to today, and the field looks genuinely different from where it stood in 2018. Not because the core problem magically vanished, but because scientists now understand exactly what they're fighting, which is often the harder half of any real breakthrough. Did you know patent filings for smart contact lens technology have surged dramatically in just the past 2 years, with more than a dozen universities from multiple countries filing new designs? A genuine sign of accelerating momentum, not a field quietly giving up. Some of the newest designs are tackling the power problem in a genuinely elegant new way. Rather than relying purely on an external wireless reader, researchers have started developing lenses that generate their own tiny amount of electricity directly from glucose in the tears themselves, using it as a built-in fuel source. Newer prototypes are also getting smarter in a different sense entirely. Some now include on-device processing that can flag an unusual reading and send an alert straight to a phone app, rather than just streaming raw numbers for a person to interpret manually themselves. None of this means a finished, store-shelf product is imminent, though. As of today, every one of these approaches remains in university labs or early-stage company research, tested on animal models or in small early human trials, not yet approved for the general public to actually buy and wear. Getting from a promising lab result to an actual approved medical device is itself a long road, typically involving years of larger human trials specifically proving accuracy is reliable enough and consistent enough to trust with real medical decisions. Exactly the bar the original Google project couldn't clear. The dream hasn't died. It's just gotten a lot more scientifically honest, built now on a much clearer understanding of exactly what made the first attempt fall short, and a genuinely wider set of tools trying to clear that same bar. So what would it genuinely take for a glucose-sensing contact lens to finally reach real people? Pulling every thread of this story together, the honest answer comes down to 3 specific things the field is actively working toward right now. Reliably isolating basal tears without contamination from blinking or irritation is the single biggest scientific hurdle left. And it's exactly the piece of the puzzle 2014-era engineers didn't even know they needed to solve, since the basal versus reflex distinction wasn't yet well understood. Even once the science is fully solved, the regulatory road is genuinely long by design. Medical devices reporting a number of people will make real health decisions from need years of large, careful trials proving they're accurate and consistent enough to trust. Exactly the bar tiers never quite cleared the first time around. It's worth sitting with the scale of what's at stake here. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide live with diabetes today, and even a partial, reliable solution to painless glucose monitoring would meaningfully improve daily life for an enormous share of them. This story is also a genuinely useful lesson about how real science actually moves. Not a straight line from brilliant idea to finished product, but idea, ambitious attempt, honest failure, deeper understanding, and then new attempts, built on exactly what the first ones taught everyone. So the next time you hear about an exciting new health technology quietly disappearing from headlines, it's worth remembering this story specifically. Sometimes disappeared really just means moved into the next, more scientifically honest phase of a problem still very much worth solving. The contact lens that was supposed to end finger pricks didn't get there in 2018, but the scientists who kept going understood exactly why it fell short. And that kind of honest failure, it turns out, is precisely how the real breakthrough eventually gets built. Here are the key references and sources for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped, like the video and subscribe for more clear, simple explainers, and I'll see you in the next one.